The morning I discovered Marcus had sold our house without my knowledge started like any other Tuesday. I was in the kitchen, grinding coffee beans and reviewing the quarterly reports for Evergreen Consulting, the small business advisory firm I'd been quietly building for the past 3 years. The sunlight streamed through the bay windows of what I thought was our dream home. Casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors, Marcus always complained about scratching. "Morning, sweetheart," Marcus called from the hallway, his voice carrying that particular tone of false cheer I'd grown to recognize. He was already dressed in his expensive charcoal suit, the one I'd helped him pick out for his promotion to senior partner at Blackstone & Associates law firm. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches, you make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. "Morning," I replied, not looking up from my laptop screen. The numbers were promising. 3 new clients this month, all mid-sized companies looking to streamline their operations. What Marcus didn't know was that one of those clients was a subsidiary of his firm's biggest competitor. Marcus poured himself coffee from the pot I'd made, adding his usual 2 sugars. "I'll be late tonight," he said, loosening his tie slightly. "Big client dinner. You know how it is." I knew exactly how it was. Marcus had been having a lot of big client dinners lately, always conveniently scheduled when I had evening consultations with my own clients. What he didn't realize was that I'd started tracking his patterns months ago, noting the inconsistencies in his stories, the subtle changes in his behavior. "Of course," I said, finally looking up with a practiced smile. "I'll probably be working late anyway. The Henderson account needs their restructuring plan by Thursday." Marcus paused, coffee cup halfway to his lips. "Still playing with your little consulting business?" The condescension in his voice was nothing new, but it stung nonetheless. For 3 years, he'd dismissed my work as a hobby, despite the fact that Evergreen Consulting was now generating more monthly revenue than his salary. But Marcus didn't know that. I'd been very careful about keeping my financial success hidden. "Something like that?" I replied evenly, closing my laptop. After Marcus left, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The Henderson account wasn't just any client. It was the manufacturing company that supplied raw materials to 3 of Blackstone & Associates' major corporate clients. What Marcus didn't know was that I'd been quietly consulting for Henderson for 6 months, helping them optimize their supply chain in ways that would ultimately save them millions. Those savings would inevitably impact the pricing structures of the companies that depended on them, including Marcus's firm's clients. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen, my business partner and former colleague from my corporate consulting days. She was the only person who knew the full scope of what Evergreen had become. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Morrison Group wants to meet next week. They're interested in our full transformation package. I smiled, typing back quickly. The Morrison Group was a Fortune 500 company that had been hemorrhaging money due to poor management structures. If we landed them, it would be our biggest contract yet, and it would put us in direct competition with the top-tier consulting firms in the city, including the one that had mysteriously passed on the Morrison account last month, claiming it wasn't a good fit. Perfect. Schedule it for Tuesday afternoon. And Sarah? Make sure we have all the competitive analysis ready. The competitive analysis was something I'd been working on for months, a comprehensive breakdown of how the major consulting firms in our market operated, their weaknesses, their client retention strategies, and most importantly, their vulnerabilities. Marcus had unknowingly provided most of the intelligence during his evening monologues about work, complaining about his firm's outdated methodologies and resistant partners. I spent the morning reviewing proposals and coordinating with our small but growing team. What had started as a one-woman operation in our spare bedroom had quietly expanded to include Sarah, 2 junior consultants, and a network of specialized contractors. We operated lean and efficient, exactly the opposite of the bloated partnerships that dominated the market. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Marcus bragged to his friends about his successful lawyer wife who didn't need to work, I was building something that could potentially disrupt his entire industry. But he'd never bothered to ask about the details of my business, never shown interest in my client meetings or strategic planning sessions. To him, I was simply the supportive spouse who managed the household and attended firm social events with the appropriate level of charm and deference. Around noon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. "Good afternoon. Is this Elena Rodriguez?" The voice was professional, female, slightly apologetic. "Yes, this is Elena. This is Jennifer Walsh from Pemberton Real Estate. I'm calling regarding the property at 1247 Maple Drive. The closing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, and we wanted to confirm the wire transfer details for your portion of the proceeds." My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. "I'm sorry, what closing?" There was a pause. "The sale of your property? Your husband Marcus Rodriguez listed it with us 6 weeks ago. The buyers have been approved for financing, and we're set to close tomorrow at 2 p.m. The world seemed to tilt slightly. "There must be some mistake. I never agreed to sell our house." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Rodriguez, according to our records, the property is owned jointly by you and your husband. Mr. Rodriguez provided documentation showing his authority to proceed with the sale. He mentioned you were traveling for business and had given him power of attorney for the transaction." I was definitely not traveling for business, and I had certainly never given Marcus power of attorney for anything, let alone selling our home. "Ms. Walsh, I need to see that documentation immediately. Can you email me everything you have?" "Of course, I'll send it right over. Mrs. Rodriguez, if there's an issue with the authorization, we need to know immediately. The buyers have already arranged movers for this weekend." After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence in our kitchen, apparently our soon-to-be former kitchen, trying to process what I'd just learned. Marcus had sold our house, without telling me, without my consent, and somehow he'd managed to convince a real estate agent that he had the legal authority to do so. My laptop chimed with an incoming email. I opened Jennifer Walsh's message with trembling fingers, downloading the attachments that would explain how my husband had managed to sell our home without my knowledge. The first document was the listing agreement, dated 6 weeks ago, signed only by Marcus. The second was a power of attorney document that I'd supposedly signed, granting Marcus authority to handle real estate transactions on my behalf. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the page. It looked remarkably like mine, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that I'd never signed it. Marcus had forged my signature. I screenshot every document, saving them to an encrypted folder on my secure server. Then I picked up my phone and called Sarah. "Elena, you sound upset. What's wrong?" "Marcus sold our house without my consent. He forged my signature on a power of attorney document and completed the sale behind my back. The closing is tomorrow." Sarah's response was immediate and sharp. "That's fraud. Multiple felonies, actually. What do you need me to do?" I took a deep breath, my mind already shifting into the strategic mode that had made me successful in consulting. "First, I need you to research Pemberton Real Estate. Find out everything. Their other recent transactions, their verification procedures, any complaints filed against them. Second, I need our lawyer on standby. And third..." I paused, looking around the kitchen that would soon belong to strangers. "I need to decide how far I'm willing to take this. How far are you thinking?" I thought about 3 years of condescending comments about my little consulting business. 3 years of being introduced as Marcus's wife who dabbles in business. Advice. 3 years of watching him take credit for insights I'd shared with him over dinner. Insights that had helped him close deals and impress his partners. All the way, Sarah. It's time Marcus learned who he's really been living with. After ending the call, I walked through our house with new eyes. Every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen paint color, every improvement we'd made together. Marcus had decided to sell it all without a word to me. But more than that, he'd committed fraud to do it. He'd forged legal documents and lied to real estate professionals, all to dispose of an asset that was legally half mine. I returned to my laptop and began documenting everything. Screenshots of the real estate listings, copies of the forged documents, records of our joint ownership. Then I started digging deeper, using the same investigative skills I applied to my consulting work. Marcus had listed the house for $847,000, significantly below market value for our neighborhood. A quick search revealed that comparable homes were selling for $950,000 to $1.1 million. He'd essentially given away over $100,000 in equity to ensure a fast sale. The question was, why? I pulled up our joint bank accounts, something I rarely checked since we maintained separate finances for the most part. What I found made my blood run cold. Marcus had been quietly draining our joint savings account for months, making large cash withdrawals that he'd never mentioned. Our emergency fund, built up over 5 years of careful saving, was nearly empty. My secure phone buzzed, the one I used exclusively for Evergreen Consulting business. The text was from David Chen, Sarah's brother and one of the best private investigators in the city. Sarah asked me to reach out. I can be there in an hour to discuss your situation. No charge for the initial consultation. Family rates. I texted back immediately. Come to the house, 1247 Maple Drive. And David, bring everything you need to document a fraud case. While waiting for David, I made another discovery that sent chills down my spine. Hidden in Marcus's home office, behind a stack of law journals, I found a manila folder containing documents I'd never seen before. Credit card statements for accounts I didn't know existed. Loan applications submitted in both our names. And most disturbing of all, a rental agreement for a luxury downtown apartment, signed by Marcus and someone named Victoria Sterling. The apartment lease was for a 2-bedroom unit in the most expensive building in the city. The monthly rent was more than our mortgage payment. And according to the lease terms, Marcus had been paying for it for 4 months. I photographed every document, my hands steadier now that I understood the scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about selling our house. Marcus was planning an entirely new life, one that apparently didn't include me. The doorbell rang exactly 1 hour after David's text. I opened the door to find a compact man in his 30s with Sarah's same sharp eyes and methodical manner. Elena? He asked, extending his hand. David Chen. Sarah tells me you have a fraud situation that needs immediate attention. I led him to the kitchen, spreading out the printed documents across our dining table. My husband sold our house without my knowledge or consent. He forged my signature on legal documents and has been draining our joint accounts. And I just discovered he's been living a double life. David studied the documents with professional detachment, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. This is comprehensive fraud, he said finally. But there's something else, isn't there? Sarah mentioned you run a consulting business. She seemed to think there might be more to this story. I hesitated for a moment, then decided that if I was going to fight back, I needed allies who understood the full picture. Marcus doesn't know that my little consulting business is actually generating significant revenue. He doesn't know about my client list, my partnerships, or my growth strategy. He sees me as the dependent spouse while he's actually been living off the success I've built. David's expression shifted slightly, a hint of what might have been admiration creeping into his professional demeanor. And you want to make sure he understands his mistake. I want to make sure he faces the consequences of his choices, I corrected. Legal consequences for the fraud and professional consequences for underestimating me. David closed his notebook and looked at me directly. Elena, what I'm about to tell you is important. If we pursue this as a fraud case, it's going to get Very ugly very quickly. Marcus will lose his law license, face criminal charges, and probably go to prison. His reputation will be destroyed, and so will his ability to earn a living in his profession. Are you prepared for that level of devastation? I thought about the forged signature, the secret apartment, the emptied bank accounts. I thought about 3 years of condescension and dismissal. I thought about being excluded from a decision that affected my home, my security, my future. David, I said, my voice steady and calm. Marcus chose to commit fraud rather than have an honest conversation with his wife. He chose to steal from our joint accounts rather than discuss financial problems. He chose to start a new life rather than work on our marriage. I'm not destroying him. I'm simply ensuring he faces the consequences of his own choices. David nodded slowly. Then let's get to work. But first, I need to know, what's your end game here? What does victory look like to you? I stood up, walking to the bay windows that overlooked the garden I'd planted and tended for 5 years. The garden that would soon belong to strangers, because my husband had decided our life together was disposable. Victory, I said, turning back to David. Looks like Marcus understanding that he severely underestimated the woman he married. It looks like him realizing that his unemployed wife was actually his superior in every way that matters. And it looks like him facing the professional and personal consequences of fraud while watching me succeed beyond his wildest imagination. David was already pulling out his phone. Then we start with documentation. Every conversation, every transaction, every lie he's told. By the time we're finished, we'll have a case so airtight that his own law firm will have no choice but to distance themselves from him. As David began making calls to his network of investigators and forensic accountants, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. For months, I'd been building Evergreen Consulting while living in the shadow of Marcus's condescension. I'd been proving my worth in the business world while he dismissed my achievements at home. But now the shadows were about to shift. Marcus thought he was leaving behind a dependent wife who would be devastated by his betrayal. Instead, he was about to discover that he'd committed fraud against a successful businesswoman who had both the resources and the determination to ensure he faced every possible consequence for his choices. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Morrison Group confirmed for Tuesday. They want to discuss a full partnership, not just consulting. This could be the breakthrough we've been working toward. I smiled, typing back. Perfect timing. By Tuesday, we're going to have a very different conversation about the future of our business. The future was about to change dramatically for everyone involved. Marcus thought he was starting a new chapter with Victoria Sterling in their luxury apartment. Instead, he was about to learn that his old chapter included a wife who was far more formidable than he'd ever imagined. And as David worked his phone, methodically building the foundation of our case, I began planning the strategic campaign that would ensure Marcus understood exactly who he had underestimated and exactly what that underestimation was going to cost him. The war hadn't started when Marcus sold our house. It had started the moment he decided I wasn't worth an honest conversation about our future. Now it was time for him to learn the difference between a dependent wife and a strategic opponent, and I intended to be an excellent teacher. David Chen worked with the efficiency of a surgeon, his phone calls creating a web of surveillance and documentation that would have impressed even Marcus's law firm partners. Within 2 hours of his arrival, he'd arranged for forensic accounting, digital investigation, and discreet surveillance of both Marcus and the mysterious Victoria Sterling. The apartment lease is just the beginning, David said, reviewing his notes. Victoria Sterling works for Meridian Financial Services. They handle investment portfolios for high-net-worth clients. Interestingly, she's also been involved in several real estate transactions over the past year, always as a buyer's agent for luxury properties. I absorbed this information while simultaneously responding to client emails on my secure laptop. The Henderson manufacturing proposal needed final revisions, and the Morrison Group meeting required preparation materials that could make or break Evergreen's expansion into Fortune 500 consulting. David, I need you to dig deeper into Victoria's background, but quietly. If she's involved in multiple real estate transactions, there might be a pattern we're missing. I paused, considering the implications. And I want to know everything about Marcus's financial situation. The emptied accounts suggest he's either in serious debt or planning something much bigger than just leaving me. My phone rang. Marcus, calling from his office number. I let it go to voicemail, watching David's eyebrows raise slightly at my calculated indifference. The voicemail was predictably casual. Hey, sweetheart. Forgot to mention I'll be out of town this weekend. Client retreat in the mountains? Love you. David was already pulling up flight records on his tablet. No corporate retreats scheduled for Blackstone and Associates this weekend? Want to bet he's going somewhere with Victoria? Take that bet, I replied, forwarding the Morrison Group materials to Sarah. But more importantly, that gives us a clear window to document everything in the house before it officially sells. The house closing was still scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, which meant I had less than 24 hours to gather evidence, protect my interests, and begin implementing the strategy that was crystallizing in my mind with each new revelation about Marcus's deception. Sarah arrived 30 minutes later, carrying her laptop and a determined expression that reminded me why we made such an effective partnership. She'd been my closest colleague during my corporate consulting days, and when I'd decided to launch Evergreen, she'd been the first person I'd approached about joining forces. The Morrison Group research is fascinating, she said without preamble, spreading documents across the dining table alongside David's fraud investigation materials. They've been struggling with internal communication issues and profit margin erosion for 2 years. 3 consulting firms have tried to help them, including Blackstone's business consulting division. That got my attention immediately. Blackstone tried to land Morrison Group? Tried and failed spectacularly, according to my source inside Morrison. Apparently, Blackstone's team presented a completely outdated approach that ignored modern digital integration strategies. The Morrison executives were, quote, underwhelmed by the traditional thinking and overconfident presentation style. I smiled, remembering countless evenings when Marcus had complained about the dinosaur partners at his firm who refused to adapt to changing business environments. What he hadn't realized was that I'd been taking mental notes, identifying exactly where traditional firms were failing their clients. Sarah, I want you to prepare a presentation that specifically addresses the shortcomings in Blackstone's proposal. To Morrison, don't mention them by name, but make it clear that we understand why previous consulting efforts have failed. David looked up from his tablet. Are you planning to use your business success as part of your response to Marcus's fraud? I'm planning to show Marcus that while he was planning his exit strategy, his unemployable wife was building something that could directly compete with his firm's most lucrative division. I pulled up Evergreen's client list on my laptop. David, I need you to investigate something else. I want to know if Marcus has been sharing confidential information about his firm's clients with Victoria or anyone else. The possibility had occurred to me when I learned about Victoria's work in financial services. If Marcus was desperate enough to forge legal documents and drain bank accounts, he might also be desperate enough to monetize confidential information. That's a serious allegation, David said carefully. If we can prove Marcus has been selling client information, it's not just fraud. It's a career-ending ethics violation that could result in criminal charges. Then we better be absolutely certain before we make any accusations, I replied. But we also need to be prepared for the possibility that this goes much deeper than a simple affair and real estate fraud. My secure phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer Walsh at Pemberton Real Estate. Mrs. Rodriguez, we need to discuss the closing tomorrow. There are some irregularities in the documentation that require your immediate attention. I showed the message to David, who nodded grimly. Someone else has noticed the forged signature. This is actually good news. It means there will be an official record of the documentation problems. I called Jennifer Walsh immediately, putting the phone on speaker so David and Sarah could hear. Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for calling back. I've been reviewing the power of attorney document more carefully, and I have some concerns about its authenticity. The notarization appears to be irregular, and the witness signature is from someone who doesn't appear in our database of approved witnesses. My heart rate accelerated, but my voice remained steady. What does this mean for tomorrow's closing? Honestly, unless you can appear in person to sign the closing documents yourself or provide a properly executed power of attorney with verified notarization, we can't proceed with the sale. David was already scribbling notes, a satisfied expression crossing his face. Ms. Walsh, this is David Chen, Mrs. Rodriguez's investigator. We believe the power of attorney document was forged without Mrs. Rodriguez's knowledge. Would you be willing to preserve all documentation related to this transaction for potential legal proceedings? There was a long pause. Mr. Chen, if you're suggesting that Mr. Rodriguez submitted fraudulent documents to facilitate this sale, we need to involve our legal department immediately. This could expose our agency to significant liability. Perfect. Marcus's fraud was about to become a problem for multiple parties, which meant multiple parties would have incentives to cooperate with our investigation. After ending the call, I felt a surge of strategic clarity. Marcus thought he was executing a clean exit, sell the house, take the money, start fresh with Victoria. Instead, he'd created a paper trail of fraud that was about to unravel in spectacular fashion. Sarah, I need you to accelerate our Morrison Group preparation. I want to schedule that meeting for tomorrow afternoon, right around the time Marcus discovers his house sale has fallen through. That's aggressive timing, Sarah observed. Are you sure you want to be in a high-stakes business meeting while dealing with this personal crisis? I considered her question seriously. The smart move might be to focus entirely on the fraud case, to let the personal situation consume my attention while we built evidence against Marcus. But that would be exactly what Marcus expected, for me to be devastated and distracted by his betrayal, to prioritize the emotional response over strategic thinking. Sarah, Marcus has spent 3 years underestimating my capabilities. Tomorrow, I want him to discover that his fraud has been exposed at exactly the same time he learns that his unemployable wife just landed the consulting contract his firm couldn't secure. David was photographing documents with professional-grade equipment, building an evidence file that would be admissible in both criminal and civil proceedings. Elena, I need to ask you something important. When Marcus discovers the house sale has fallen through, he's going to panic. Panic makes people dangerous and unpredictable. Are you prepared for him to potentially escalate this situation? I thought. About the man I'd married 5 years ago, before success had changed him, before arrogance had replaced the kindness that had initially attracted me. That Marcus would never have forged my signature or drained our accounts. But the current Marcus had already crossed ethical and legal lines I would never have imagined him crossing. David, I want 24-hour security arranged, starting tonight. Nothing obvious, but I want to know where Marcus is and what he's doing at all times. And I want security at my office as well. If he's desperate enough to commit fraud, he might be desperate enough to try sabotaging my business. Sarah was already on her phone calling our IT security consultant. Elena, I'm having our servers backed up to redundant locations tonight. If Marcus knows anything about your business operations, we need to assume he might try to cause damage. The afternoon dissolved into intensive preparation on multiple fronts. David coordinated with forensic specialists and lawyers while building comprehensive surveillance protocols. Sarah refined our Morrison Group presentation while implementing enhanced security measures for Evergreen's digital assets. And I found myself in the surreal position of preparing for both a fraud case against my husband and the most important business meeting of my career. Around 6 p.m., my personal phone rang. Marcus, calling from what was probably Victoria's apartment. Elena, where are you? I stopped by the house and you weren't there. His voice carried a note of tension that hadn't been there this morning. Had someone already contacted him about problems with the closing? "I'm at the office working on the Henderson proposal," I lied smoothly. "Remember? I told you I'd be working late." "Right. Your consulting thing." The dismissiveness was automatic, but underneath it I detected something else. Worry, maybe even fear. "Elena, we need to talk when I get back from my weekend trip. There are some changes we need to discuss." So he was planning to tell me about the sale after it was already completed. Probably presented as a fait accompli, maybe even position himself as the decisive husband who'd handled a complicated situation while his wife was busy with her little hobby business. "Of course, Marcus. We can talk when you get back. Have a good weekend." After hanging up, I looked at David and Sarah, both of whom had been listening to my side of the conversation. "He doesn't know yet," Sarah observed. "The real estate agent hasn't called him about the closing problems." David checked his watch. "Jennifer Walsh said she needed to contact their legal department. My guess is Marcus will get a call from Pemberton's lawyers within the next few hours, asking him to explain the fraudulent documentation." I felt a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. Marcus was probably planning to spend the weekend celebrating with Victoria, believing he'd successfully executed his exit strategy. Instead, he was about to discover that his fraud had been exposed and that the elaborate deception he'd constructed was collapsing around him. "David, when Marcus gets that call, I want to know about it immediately. I want recordings if possible, and I want to know exactly how he responds." "Already arranged. We've got surveillance on his known locations and monitoring on his communications. If he panics, we'll know about it." Sarah was reviewing her notes from the Morrison Group research. "Elena, there's something else you should know about the Morrison opportunity. They're not just looking for consulting services. They're considering bringing their business transformation efforts in-house. If we handle this right, they might offer us a permanent partnership that could quintuple our revenue." The implications were staggering. A partnership with Morrison Group wouldn't just be a single consulting contract. It would be the foundation for transforming Evergreen from a small consulting firm into a major player in the business transformation industry. "Sarah, what would that mean in terms of competing with firms like Blackstone?" "It would mean we'd be directly competing for the same Fortune 500 clients. And given what happened with Blackstone's failed Morrison pitch, we'd have a significant advantage in terms of modern methodology and innovative thinking." I thought about Marcus's upcoming discovery that his house sale had fallen through due to fraudulent documentation. I thought about him learning that his fraud had created legal liability for multiple parties. And I thought about him eventually discovering that while he was planning his escape, his wife had been building a business that could directly threaten his firm's market position. "David, I want you to research every client Blackstone has lost in the past year. I want to know why they lost them, who they lost them to, and whether any of those clients might be interested in Evergreen's services." David's smile was predatory. "Elena, you're not just planning to expose Marcus's fraud. You're planning to systematically dismantle his professional reputation while demonstrating your own superior capabilities." "I'm planning to ensure Marcus understands the true cost of underestimating me," I corrected. "The fraud case will handle the legal consequences of his choices, but the business competition will handle the professional consequences of his arrogance, as thou." Night fell. I stood in the kitchen of the house Marcus had tried to sell without my knowledge, surrounded by evidence of his deception and plans for my own strategic response. In 12 hours, Marcus would discover that his carefully planned fraud had been exposed. In 18 hours, I would be presenting to Morrison Group, potentially securing a partnership that would transform my business into a direct competitor to his firm. But the real satisfaction wouldn't come from his panic when the fraud was exposed, or even from landing the Morrison contract. The real satisfaction would come from Marcus eventually understanding that while he was planning to leave his unemployed wife, he was actually betraying a woman who had the skills, resources, and determination to ensure he faced every possible consequence for his choices. The war was about to begin in earnest, and Marcus was about to learn that he'd been fighting an opponent who was several moves ahead of him from the very beginning. The call came at 11:47 p.m., just as I was reviewing the final slides for tomorrow's Morrison Group presentation. David's voice was tense with barely contained excitement. "Elena, Marcus just got the call from Pemberton's legal department. We have audio." I set down my coffee and activated the secure recording app on my laptop. David's surveillance team had been monitoring Marcus's communications since this afternoon, and the conversation he was about to play would be the first crack in Marcus's carefully constructed facade. The audio quality was crystal clear. Marcus's voice, initially confident and slightly annoyed at being disturbed during his romantic weekend, gradually shifting to confusion, then panic, then barely controlled rage. "What do you mean irregularities in the documentation?" Marcus was saying, "I provided everything your agent requested." The lawyer's response was professional but firm. "Mr. Rodriguez, the power of attorney document appears to have been notarized improperly, and our document analyst has questions about the signature. Authenticity. We need Mrs. Rodriguez to appear in person for the closing, or we cannot proceed with the sale." There was a long silence. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed completely. The entitled confidence replaced by something desperate and calculating. "Look, my wife she's been having some emotional difficulties lately. She signed those documents, but she might not remember doing so. She's been under a lot of stress." I felt ice water flood my veins. Marcus was trying to claim I had mental health issues to explain away his forged signature. The lawyer's response suggested they weren't buying it. "Mr. Rodriguez, if there are questions about Mrs. Rodriguez's capacity to sign legal documents, that's an even more serious concern. We would need medical documentation and court-appointed oversight. I'm afraid we'll have to postpone the closing indefinitely pending resolution of these issues." The call ended with Marcus demanding to speak to Jennifer Walsh directly, his voice escalating to near shouting by the final exchange. David paused the recording. "Elena, he's not just panicking about the failed sale. Listen to this. We recorded his call to Victoria immediately afterward. The second recording was even more revealing." Marcus, no longer trying to maintain his professional composure, was explaining the situation to Victoria in terms that made their relationship and future plans crystal clear. The closing fell through. "They're saying the documents are fraudulent. Victoria, we need that money for the Cayman account setup. Without the house sale proceeds, we don't have enough liquid capital to make the offshore transfer before the quarter ends." Victoria's voice was sharp with worry. "Marcus, you promised me this was clean. You said your wife was a non-factor, that she wouldn't even notice the sale until after we were established in the islands." "She shouldn't have noticed. Elena doesn't pay attention to financial details. She's too busy playing consultant to care about real estate transactions." The conversation continued with Victoria pressuring Marcus to find alternative funding sources, and Marcus becoming increasingly agitated about the impossible timing of the documentation review. When the recording ended, I sat in stunned silence. The offshore account, the Cayman setup, the quarter-end deadline, Marcus wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to flee the country with significant assets, probably including money that didn't belong to him. "David, we need to involve federal authorities. If Marcus is moving money offshore and there's a specific timeline involved, he might be stealing from his law firm or their clients. Already on it. I have a contact at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. But Elena, there's something else you need to know. Victoria Sterling isn't just Marcus's girlfriend. She's been under investigation for facilitating money laundering through luxury real estate transactions. The scope of Marcus's deception was expanding beyond anything I'd imagined. My husband wasn't just cheating and committing fraud. He was involved with someone who was potentially running criminal financial operations. "David, I want enhanced security immediately. If Marcus is working with Victoria and she's involved in money laundering, we're not just dealing with a desperate husband anymore. We're dealing with people who have serious criminal exposure. Phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Morrison Group moved the meeting to 9 a.m. tomorrow. They want to discuss immediate implementation of emergency restructuring services. This could be worth 7 figures. I stared at the message, struck by the surreal timing. In less than 10 hours, I would be sitting across from Fortune 500 executives, potentially securing the most important business deal of my career, while my husband was panicking about failed fraud schemes and international money laundering operations. Sarah, confirm the 9 a.m. meeting and tell them we're prepared to discuss immediate implementation. Also, have our lawyers standing by. We might need to disclose some information about potential conflicts of interest. David was already coordinating with his federal contacts, speaking in the coded language of professional investigators. When he finished his calls, he turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Elena, the FBI is very interested in both Marcus and Victoria. They've been building a case against Victoria's operation for months, and Marcus's involvement gives them leverage they didn't have before? What kind of leverage? The kind that could result in Marcus facing federal charges carrying 20-year sentences instead of state fraud charges carrying 2-year sentences. But they want to use you as a cooperating witness. I absorbed this information while calculating the implications. Cooperating with federal investigators would mean my testimony could help send Marcus to prison for decades. It would also mean my personal situation would become part of a major criminal investigation. David, what do they need from me? Access to your house, your joint financial records, and any information you might have about Marcus's business activities. They're particularly interested in whether he's been using his law firm's client accounts for the offshore transfers. The house that Marcus had tried to sell without my knowledge was about to become the center of a federal criminal investigation. The joint accounts he'd been draining were about to be scrutinized by financial crime specialists, and the business activities he'd dismissed as my little consulting hobby were about to provide the foundation for bringing down what appeared to be a sophisticated money laundering operation. My secure phone rang, Jennifer Walsh from Pemberton Real Estate, calling at nearly midnight. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm calling because we've had some concerning developments regarding your property sale. Without going into details over the phone, I need you to know that we've been contacted by federal authorities regarding the documentation issues. Federal authorities? I can't say more, but Mrs. Rodriguez, if you're not already working with law enforcement, you should consider doing so immediately. The irregularities in your sale appear to be part of a much larger investigation. After hanging up, I found myself standing in my kitchen at midnight, surrounded by evidence of a fraud scheme that had expanded into federal money laundering investigations, while simultaneously preparing for a business meeting that could transform my company into a major consulting firm. The irony was staggering. Marcus had tried to sell our house to fund his escape with Victoria, not knowing that Victoria was under federal investigation. He'd dismissed my consulting business as irrelevant while planning to flee to the Cayman Islands, not realizing that my business success was about to provide the platform for a complete professional triumph. Elena, Sarah said quietly, are you sure you want to proceed with the Morrison meeting tomorrow? This situation with Marcus is getting very complicated very quickly. I looked at my business partner, my closest ally in building Evergreen Consulting, from a spare bedroom operation into something that could compete with major firms. Sarah was right that the timing was challenging, but she was wrong about the priorities. Sarah, Marcus spent 3 years telling me that my business was a hobby while he was secretly planning to commit federal crimes. Tomorrow morning I'm going to secure a partnership that could make Evergreen a direct competitor to his firm. Tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to help federal investigators build a case that could send him to prison for decades. David was monitoring multiple communication streams on his tablet, tracking Marcus's increasingly desperate attempts to contact people who could help him solve his documentation problems. Elena, Marcus just tried to call 3 different lawyers, including 2 from his own firm. None of them are answering their phones. He's also tried to contact someone at a document preparation service, probably looking for help with creating new fraudulent paperwork. Is he still with Victoria? Yes, and they're both clearly aware that their timeline has collapsed. Victoria just made a call to someone discussing alternative exit strategies and accelerated asset liquidation. The phrase alternative exit strategies sent a chill through me. If Victoria was involved in money laundering and their original plan had collapsed, they might be desperate enough to attempt something even more dangerous. David, I want constant surveillance on both of them, and I want to know immediately if they attempt to leave the city or access any significant funds. My laptop chimed with an encrypted message from our IT security consultant. Unusual activity detected on Evergreen's network. Multiple attempts to access client files from an external IP address. Attempts blocked, but suggest immediate password changes and enhanced authentication. Sarah, someone's trying to hack our client database. Change every password and implement two-factor authentication on all accounts immediately. David looked up from his tablet with a grim expression. Elena, the hacking attempts are coming from Victoria's apartment building. Marcus is trying to access your business files. The scope of Marcus's desperation was becoming clear. His fraudulent house sale had failed, his offshore money transfer was compromised, and now he was attempting to steal my business information, probably hoping to find something he could use as leverage or sell to competitors. David, can we trace exactly what files he was trying to access? Already on it. He was specifically targeting your client contracts, financial records, and strategic planning documents. If he'd succeeded, he would have had access to proprietary information about major corporations and your expansion plans. I felt a surge of cold anger. Marcus hadn't just tried to steal our house and drain our accounts. He was now attempting to sabotage the business I'd built through years of careful work and strategic planning. Sarah, I want you to prepare a supplementary presentation for Morrison Group. I want to show them exactly why our security protocols and confidentiality measures exceed industry standards. Elena, are you planning to use Marcus's hacking attempt as a selling point? I'm planning to demonstrate that Evergreen Consulting can protect sensitive corporate information even when under attack from sophisticated bad actors. Morrison Group will appreciate knowing that their transformation strategy would be completely secure with us. As the clock struck 1 a.m., I made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. Tomorrow, I would cooperate with federal investigators to build a case against my husband while simultaneously securing the most important business deal of my career. Marcus thought he was executing an exit strategy that would leave me devastated and financially ruined. Instead, his crimes were about to provide the foundation for my complete professional triumph and his total destruction. The perfect storm was building, and by tomorrow evening, Marcus would understand that he'd severely underestimated not just my capabilities, but my willingness to ensure he faced every possible consequence for his choices. But first, I had a presentation to finalize and a company to transform. After all, the best revenge wasn't just destroying Marcus's future, it was building something so successful that his downfall would be remembered as a footnote to my rise. At 7:30 a.m., I stood in the marble lobby of Morrison Group's headquarters, dressed in my most authoritative charcoal Armani suit, carrying presentation materials that could transform Evergreen Consulting into a Fortune 500 partner. In my earpiece, David Chen's voice provided real-time updates on Marcus's increasingly desperate situation. Marcus and Victoria left her apartment 20 minutes ago. They're heading toward Blackstone and Associates. Our FBI contact thinks he's going to try accessing his firm's client accounts before anyone realizes what's happening. I adjusted my wireless earpiece, ensuring it was invisible beneath my carefully styled hair. The Morrison Group executives would never know that I was simultaneously managing a federal investigation while presenting the most important business proposal of my career. Keep me updated, but only emergency interruptions during the meeting. I whispered into my phone before switching it to silent mode. Sarah arrived precisely at 7:45. Carrying backup presentation materials and the confidence that had made our partnership so successful. She looked me over with the critical eye of someone who understood that the next 2 hours could determine our company's entire future. Elena, you look like you could buy and sell this entire building. Are you ready to change everything? I thought about Marcus, probably sitting in some FBI surveillance vehicle outside his law firm, unaware that his attempted crimes had been documented and traced. I thought about the forged signature that had started this entire cascade of revelations. I thought about 3 years of condescension and dismissal. Sarah, I've never been more ready for anything in my life. The Morrison Group's executive conference room was a testament to corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a mahogany table that could seat 20, and walls lined with awards and recognition for business excellence. Seated around the table were 5 executives who controlled a company with annual revenues exceeding $2 billion. Margaret Chen, Morrison's CEO, stood to greet us with the measured warmth of someone who had built her reputation on strategic decision-making. Ms. Rodriguez, Ms. Chen, thank you for accommodating our accelerated timeline. Recent developments have made it clear that Morrison Group needs immediate transformation services. Recent developments was corporate speak for "we're in crisis" mode, which explained why they'd moved our meeting forward and why they were considering bringing transformation services in-house rather than outsourcing to traditional consulting firms. Ms. Chen, we appreciate the opportunity to discuss how Evergreen can address Morrison's immediate needs while building sustainable long-term advantages, I replied, taking my seat at the table with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was offering. My earpiece crackled softly, David's voice barely audible. Marcus is inside Blackstone. FBI has surveillance in place. Continue with your meeting. For the next hour, Sarah and I presented a transformation strategy that systematically addressed every weakness in traditional consulting approaches. We demonstrated how Evergreen's methodologies could identify and resolve operational inefficiencies while implementing modern digital integration that legacy firms couldn't match. The fundamental difference, I explained, clicking to a slide, that showed comparative results, is that traditional consulting firms apply one-size-fits-all solutions based on outdated frameworks. Evergreen develops customized transformation strategies that leverage your existing strengths while addressing specific organizational challenges. Margaret Chen leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. Ms. Rodriguez, you're describing exactly the kind of innovative thinking we've been missing from other consulting firms. Can you give us a specific example of how this approach has worked with similar companies? I smiled, thinking of the Henderson manufacturing optimization that had saved them millions while simultaneously improving their supply chain efficiency. Sarah, would you walk them through the Henderson case study? Sarah's presentation was flawless, demonstrating how our approach had transformed a struggling manufacturing company into an industry leader within 18 months. What she didn't mention, what the Morrison executives didn't need to know, was that Henderson's transformation had also impacted the cost structures of several companies that used Blackstone and Associates for legal services. My earpiece crackled again. Emergency update. Marcus is attempting to access encrypted client files. FBI is recording everything. I maintained my professional expression while processing the implications. Marcus was so desperate that he was committing additional federal crimes in real time, probably hoping to find something valuable enough to fund his escape with Victoria. Ms. Rodriguez, said Thomas Morrison, the company's COO, your approach is impressive, but we need to discuss implementation timeline. How quickly could Evergreen begin providing comprehensive transformation services? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The transition from consulting services to strategic partnership. Mr. Morrison, Evergreen is prepared to begin immediate implementation with a dedicated team. However, given the scope of Morrison Group's transformation needs, we'd recommend considering a more integrated approach. Margaret Chen's expression sharpened with interest. What kind of integrated approach? A strategic partnership that brings Evergreen's transformation capabilities directly into Morrison Group's operational structure. Rather than outsourcing transformation to external consultants, You would have dedicated specialists working exclusively on Morrison's continuous improvement initiatives. The room fell silent as the executives absorbed the implications. What I was proposing would eliminate their need for traditional consulting firms while giving them access to cutting-edge transformation methodologies that could provide sustained competitive advantages. Ms. Rodriguez, Margaret Chen said slowly, are you suggesting that Evergreen would become a wholly owned subsidiary of Morrison Group? I'm suggesting a partnership structure that gives Morrison Group exclusive access to our transformation expertise while allowing Evergreen to focus entirely on your company's success. The specific legal framework would depend on your strategic preferences. Sarah was ready with the financial projections, demonstrating how the partnership structure would save Morrison Group millions annually while providing access to transformation, services that could increase operational efficiency by 40% or more. My earpiece crackled with urgency. Marcus triggered security protocols at Blackstone. FBI is moving in. Situation escalating rapidly. I forced myself to maintain focus on the executives around the table, while my husband's criminal career imploded 20 miles away. The convergence was perfect. As Marcus destroyed his professional future through desperate criminal acts, I was building the foundation for Evergreen's transformation into a major corporate partner. The partnership proposal is intriguing, Thomas Morrison said, reviewing Sarah's financial projections. But we'd need guarantees about proprietary information security and competitive advantages. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. Mr. Morrison, Evergreen's security protocols exceed industry standards. In fact, just last night we successfully defended against a sophisticated hacking attempt that was trying to access our client databases. The executives exchanged glances, clearly impressed that we'd proactively addressed their security concerns. Can you tell us more about this security incident? Margaret Chen asked. Without compromising the ongoing investigation, I can tell you that the attack was traced to known bad actors who are currently under federal investigation for financial crimes. Our security systems not only prevented any data breach, but also provided evidence that's being used by law enforcement. It was technically true. Marcus's hacking attempt had been traced and was now part of the FBI's evidence file. The executives didn't need to know that the known bad actor was my soon-to-be ex-husband. My earpiece delivered David's voice with barely controlled excitement. Marcus has been arrested inside Blackstone and Associates. Victoria was taken into custody at her apartment, both charged with federal crimes. FBI wants to meet with you this afternoon. I felt a surge of satisfaction so intense it was almost physical. Marcus had just been arrested for federal crimes while I was securing the business deal that would transform Evergreen into a major corporate entity. Ms. Rodriguez, Margaret Chen said, we're prepared to move forward with partnership discussions immediately. What would you need from us to begin the due diligence process? Access to your current operational data, strategic planning documents, and transformation priorities. We can begin the assessment phase within 48 hours and provide preliminary recommendations within 2 weeks. The next 30 minutes were spent outlining timeline details, resource requirements, and legal frameworks. By the time the meeting concluded, Evergreen Consulting had secured a partnership agreement that would quintuple our revenue while giving us exclusive access to Fortune 500 level projects. As Sarah and I walked toward the elevator, Margaret Chen caught up with us. Ms. Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind me asking, but you seem remarkably composed for someone who apparently dealt with a cybersecurity incident last night. How do you maintain that level of professional focus under pressure? I thought about Marcus, probably sitting in a federal detention facility by now, finally understanding that his unemployable wife had been several steps ahead of him throughout his entire criminal scheme. Ms. Chen, I've learned that the best response to people who underestimate you is to exceed every expectation while they're busy making mistakes. Crisis management is just another form of strategic thinking. Margaret Chen smiled with the appreciation of one strategic thinker recognizing another. Ms. Rodriguez, I think this partnership is going to be very successful. In the elevator, Sarah waited until the doors closed before allowing her professional composure to crack slightly. "Elena, we just secured the biggest deal in Evergreens history. This partnership could make us one of the premier transformation consultancies in the country." My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Marcus and Victoria both in federal custody. FBI wants full debrief at 2 p.m. Bring all documentation we've gathered." I showed the message to Sarah, whose eyes widened as she processed the timeline. "Elena, you just closed the Morrison deal while your husband was being arrested for federal crimes. That's either the best timing in history or incredible strategic planning." "Sarah, Marcus created his own timeline when he decided to commit fraud. I just made sure my timeline intersected with his consequences at exactly the right moment." As we exited the Morrison Group building, I felt the weight of 3 years of underestimation lifting from my shoulders. Marcus had spent our entire marriage dismissing my capabilities while secretly planning to steal from me and flee the country. Instead, his crimes had been exposed while I was securing a business partnership that would make me a legitimate competitor to every major consulting firm in the industry. The convergence was complete. Marcus's criminal career had ended in federal custody while my professional career had just reached an entirely new level. And the beautiful irony was that his underestimation of me had been the foundation for both outcomes. In a few hours, I would meet with federal investigators to provide testimony that could send Marcus to prison for decades. But right now, I was going to savor the moment when everything Marcus had tried to steal from me had instead become the foundation for my complete professional triumph. After all, the best revenge wasn't just ensuring Marcus faced consequences for his crimes. It was succeeding so spectacularly that his downfall would be remembered as the moment when his biggest mistake became his greatest regret. The FBI field office was a study in purposeful intimidation, stark fluorescent lighting, gray walls, and the kind of institutional furniture designed to make everyone uncomfortable. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez led me through a maze of corridors to a conference room, where the full scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise was laid out across multiple whiteboards like a corporate conspiracy flowchart. "Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for coming in. Your cooperation has been instrumental in building this case." Agent Martinez gestured to a chair across from David Chen, who had arrived an hour earlier with boxes of documentation we'd gathered over the past 48 hours. Settled into the uncomfortable chair, studying the evidence boards that mapped out connections between Marcus, Victoria Sterling, offshore accounts, and what appeared to be a sophisticated money laundering operation involving luxury real estate transactions. "Agent Martinez, I need to understand the full scope of what Marcus was involved in. Yesterday morning, I thought I was dealing with simple marital fraud. Now you're showing me federal money laundering charts." Agent Martinez exchanged glances with her partner, Agent Kim, before activating a digital recorder. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your husband wasn't just Victoria Sterling's romantic partner. He was her legal counsel and co-conspirator in a scheme that moved over $15 million through fake real estate transactions over the past 18 months. The number hit me like a physical blow. $15 million. Marcus hadn't just been planning to leave me. He'd been systematically stealing from multiple sources to fund an international criminal operation. "Agent Kim will walk you through what we've discovered," Agent Martinez continued, nodding to her partner. Agent Kim pulled up a series of financial documents on a large monitor. Marcus used his position at Blackstone and Associates to identify high-net-worth clients with significant liquid assets. He would then coordinate with Victoria to create fictional real estate investment opportunities, using forged documents and fraudulent property valuations to convince clients to transfer funds to offshore accounts. I studied the transaction records, scrolling across the screen, recognizing several names from Marcus's dinner party conversations over the years. These are his law firm's clients. He was stealing from people who trusted him with their legal representation. Exactly. But it gets worse. Marcus was also manipulating escrow accounts for legitimate real estate transactions, skimming portions of funds that should have gone to sellers or buyers. Your house sale was going to be their final score before fleeing to the Cayman Islands. Agent Martinez pulled up surveillance photos of Marcus and Victoria meeting with various individuals over the past year. We've been tracking Victoria's operation for 8 months, but we couldn't prove Marcus's involvement until yesterday when he attempted to access encrypted client files at his law firm. I thought about the Morrison Group meeting this morning, how I'd presented Evergreen's security protocols while Marcus was literally committing federal crimes 20 miles away. Agent Martinez, how many victims are we talking about? 37 confirmed victims, with potential losses totaling over $23 million. Some of these people lost their retirement savings, others lost money they'd inherited from deceased relatives. Marcus and Victoria weren't just stealing, they were destroying lives. The weight of Marcus's crimes settled over me like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't just about our marriage or his attempts to defraud me personally. He'd been systematically victimizing vulnerable people who had trusted him with their most important financial decisions. "What do you need from me?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Agent Kim activated another screen showing bank records and financial transfers. "We need you to walk us through every joint account, every financial discussion you had with Marcus, and any documentation you might have about his spending patterns or unexplained income." For the next 2 hours, I provided detailed testimony about Marcus's financial behavior, his mysterious cash expenditures, and the gradual changes in his lifestyle that I'd attributed to his law firm's success. Agent Martinez recorded everything while Agent Kim took notes and cross-referenced my information with their existing evidence. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Agent Martinez said during a break, "your husband's arrest this morning triggered something we call a cooperation cascade. Other conspirators are already reaching out to negotiate plea agreements. Victoria Sterling is facing life in prison, and she's extremely motivated to provide information about everyone involved in the operation." David leaned forward from his position at the table. "What kind of information is Victoria providing?" "Names, dates, financial details, and most importantly, evidence that Marcus wasn't just a co-conspirator. He was one of the operation's primary architects. Victoria may have been the face of the real estate fraud, but Marcus designed the legal frameworks that made it possible." I absorbed this revelation while calculating the implications. Marcus hadn't just joined Victoria's criminal operation, he'd helped create it using his legal expertise to construct sophisticated fraud schemes that had victimized dozens of people. "Agent Martinez, what's Marcus's legal situation? What charges is he facing? Wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, racketeering, and violation of attorney ethical standards. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at 40 to 60 years in federal prison." 40 to 60 years. Marcus would spend the rest of his life in prison for crimes he'd committed while dismissing my business achievements and planning to abandon our marriage. The justice was so complete, it felt almost surreal. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Morrison Group signed the partnership agreement. Legal team wants to discuss implementation timeline. When can you meet?" I showed the message to Agent Martinez, who read it with interest. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your business success is actually relevant to our case. Marcus's attempts to hack your client database yesterday suggest he was planning to sell proprietary business information to fund his escape. Can you prove that?" Agent Kim pulled up digital forensics reports on another screen. Marcus's computer searches from Victoria's apartment show he was researching how to monetize corporate consulting data. He'd identified several of your clients as potential targets for industrial espionage. The scope of Marcus's betrayal continued expanding. He hadn't just tried to steal our house and drain our accounts. He'd planned to destroy my business by selling client information to competitors. "Agent Martinez, I need to inform my clients about the security breach attempt. Some of them are handling sensitive corporate transformations that could be compromised if Marcus gained access to strategic information. Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez, your quick response to the hacking attempt and your cooperation with our investigation provides excellent evidence of your company's security protocols. You might find that clients appreciate your proactive approach to protecting their interests. Agent Martinez was right. The Morrison Group executives had been impressed by our cybersecurity response, and other clients would likely have similar reactions. Marcus's criminal activities were inadvertently providing evidence of Evergreen's superior business practices. There's something else, Agent Kim added, consulting his notes. Marcus's law firm is facing potential collapse. When Blackstone and Associates learns about his crimes against their clients, they'll face massive liability lawsuits and regulatory sanctions. The firm that employed your husband will probably cease to exist within 6 months. I thought about the business landscape that was about to change dramatically. Blackstone and Associates had been one of the largest law firms in the city, with a business consulting division that competed directly with companies like Evergreen. Their collapse would create opportunities for smaller, more agile firms to capture market share. Agent Martinez, when will this information become public? The arrests were announced this afternoon. Tomorrow's news cycle will include details about the money laundering operation and the law firm's involvement. By Monday, every business publication will be covering the story. Sarah's timing for the Morrison Group partnership couldn't have been more perfect. By the time news of the scandal broke, Evergreen would already be positioned as the ethical alternative to traditional consulting firms that had been compromised by criminal activities. Mrs. Rodriguez, Agent Martinez said, we need to discuss victim restitution. Federal prosecutors will be seeking recovery of stolen assets to compensate the fraud victims. That includes property that was purchased with criminal proceeds. What does that mean for our house? Since the sale was attempted through fraudulent means and was intended to fund criminal activities, the property will likely be seized as a criminal asset. However, as a defrauded spouse, you'll have legal standing to claim your legitimate ownership interest. David had been taking notes throughout the briefing. Elena, the federal seizure might actually work in your favor. If the government seizes the house as criminal proceeds, they'll need to compensate you for your legitimate ownership share at fair market value. The irony was perfect. Marcus had tried to sell our house for below market value to fund his escape. But federal asset seizure would ensure I received full compensation for my ownership interest, while he received nothing. Agent Martinez, what happens next? Marcus and Victoria will be arraigned Monday morning. The grand jury will hear evidence for the next several weeks, and we expect additional indictments as we trace money through various offshore accounts. Your testimony will be crucial for establishing the timeline and Marcus's intent to defraud you personally. As the debriefing concluded, I found myself in the surreal position of having provided testimony that would likely send my husband to prison for life while simultaneously securing business partnerships that would transform my company into a major consulting firm. Walking out of the FBI field office with David, I felt a strange combination of vindication and exhaustion. Marcus's criminal enterprise had been exposed. His victims would receive justice, and his professional destruction was complete. Elena, David said as we reached the parking garage. In 30 years of investigation work, I've never seen anyone handle a situation like this with your level of strategic thinking. Most people would have been devastated by discovering their spouse's crimes. You turned it into a competitive advantage. I thought about tomorrow's news cycle, when Marcus's arrest would be front-page business news while my Morrison Group partnership was announced. The timing would create a narrative of ethical business practices triumphing over criminal corruption. David, Marcus spent 3 years underestimating my capabilities while planning to destroy everything I'd built. He thought he was leaving behind a dependent wife who would be ruined by his betrayal. I paused, looking up at the city skyline where Morrison Group's headquarters stood as a monument to the business success that Marcus had never believed I could achieve. Instead, he discovered that his biggest mistake was underestimating the woman who was going to ensure he faced every possible consequence for his choices. The criminal investigation was just beginning, but Marcus's reckoning was already complete. By Monday morning, he would be sitting in federal detention while I was announcing Evergreen's transformation into a major consulting firm. After all, the best revenge wasn't just ensuring justice for his crimes, it was succeeding so completely that his downfall became the foundation for my greatest triumph. Monday morning arrived with the kind of media frenzy that transforms ordinary news into cultural phenomenon. By 6 a.m., 3 news vans were parked outside what had been our house, and my phone was buzzing with interview requests from business journalists, crime reporters, and television producers who had discovered that the Blackstone money laundering scandal involved a brilliant consulting entrepreneur married to one of the primary conspirators. I sat in my temporary downtown office, a lease Sarah had negotiated over the weekend while I was providing additional testimony to federal prosecutors, watching the news coverage unfold across multiple screens. The story had everything media outlets craved: corporate corruption, romantic betrayal, sophisticated financial crimes, and the dramatic irony of a successful businesswoman whose criminal husband had tried to destroy the very enterprise that would ultimately eclipse his firm's reputation. "Elena, you need to see this," Sarah called from her desk, where she was monitoring social media reactions and business publication coverage. The Wall Street Journal's lead story isn't just about Marcus's arrest. It's about how Evergreen Consulting represents the future of ethical business transformation services. I reviewed the article on my secure tablet, noting how the journalist had positioned our Morrison Group partnership as evidence that innovative consulting firms were displacing traditional law firm business divisions compromised by criminal activities. The timing was so perfect it seemed orchestrated, though of course it was simply the natural consequence of Marcus's crimes converging with my strategic planning. Business Insider wants an exclusive interview, Sarah continued, scrolling through media requests. They're calling it the Consulting Revolution, how one woman built an empire, while her husband built a criminal enterprise. The phone rang. Margaret Chen from Morrison Group, calling presumably to discuss how the scandal might affect our partnership. Agreement. "Ms. Rodriguez, I wanted to reach out personally about this morning's news coverage. Obviously, we were unaware of your personal situation when we negotiated our partnership, but I want you to know that Morrison Group's confidence in Evergreen remains absolute." Relief flooded through me. "Ms. Chen, I appreciate your call. I understand if Morrison Group needs to reconsider the partnership given the media attention." "Actually, Ms. Rodriguez, quite the opposite. The fact that you were building a successful consulting firm while your husband was committing federal crimes demonstrates exactly the kind of integrity and focus we want in a strategic partner. Your quick response to the cybersecurity incident makes even more sense now. You were literally defending your business against criminal attack from within your own household." Margaret Chen's support was more valuable than she realized. With Morrison Group's endorsement, other potential clients would see the scandal not as a liability, but as evidence of Evergreen's exceptional security and ethical standards. David Chen arrived at 9 a.m. with updated intelligence about the expanding federal investigation. "Elena, the asset seizures began this weekend. FBI has frozen accounts containing over $8 million in criminal proceeds, and they've identified luxury purchases that will be sold to fund victim restitution." He spread surveillance photos across my desk showing federal agents removing artwork, jewelry, and electronics from Victoria's apartment. Marcus's personal assets are also being seized, including his car, investment accounts, and the contents of several safety deposit boxes that prosecutors didn't know existed until Victoria provided the details. "What about the house?" "Federal marshals will take possession Wednesday. As the defrauded spouse, you'll receive fair market compensation for your ownership interest, probably around $500,000 after legal fees. Marcus will receive nothing." I calculated the implications while reviewing the morning's business. Proposals. The house compensation would provide liquid capital for Evergreen's expansion, funded ironically by Marcus's failed attempt to steal the property from me. "David, what's happening with the other conspirators Victoria mentioned?" 3 additional arrests over the weekend, including a banker who facilitated the offshore transfers and an accountant who created fraudulent tax documents. The prosecutor estimates 12 to 15 total defendants when the investigation concludes. My secure phone buzzed with a text from Henderson Manufacturing's CEO. Saw the news. Want to discuss expanding our contract to include comprehensive risk management consulting. Your experience with internal threats obviously exceeds industry standards. The Henderson message was followed by similar inquiries from 2 other existing clients and 3 potential new ones. Marcus's criminal activities were inadvertently generating business opportunities by demonstrating Evergreen's superior security protocols and ethical standards. Sarah, I want you to prepare a crisis management consulting package. Other companies will want to know how to protect themselves against internal threats like the ones we successfully defended against. Elena, you're essentially monetizing Marcus's criminal behavior. His fraud attempt is becoming a business case study that proves our consulting effectiveness. The irony was exquisite. Marcus had tried to destroy my business through hacking and industrial espionage, but his criminal activities were instead providing evidence of Evergreen's exceptional capabilities that attracted new clients and expanded our service offerings. The phone rang again, this time an unknown number with a 202 area code. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Patricia Williams from the Senate Committee on Banking and Financial Crimes. We're conducting hearings on money laundering through professional services, and we'd like you to testify about your experience as a victim of attorney-facilitated fraud. Congressional testimony would provide a national platform to discuss both the criminal activities I'd survived and the business success I'd achieved. The narrative would be perfect. Ethical entrepreneur triumphs over criminal corruption through superior business practices and strategic thinking. Ms. Williams, I'd be honored to testify. When would the committee like to schedule my appearance? Next Thursday, if possible. Your case represents exactly the kind of victim impact and business resilience we want to highlight in our recommendations for regulatory reform. After ending the call, I realized that Marcus's crimes were about to make me a nationally recognized expert on business ethics and security protocols. The congressional testimony would establish Evergreen as the premier consulting firm for companies concerned about internal threats and ethical compliance. Elena, David said, reviewing his tablet. Marcus's arraignment is this afternoon. The prosecutor expects him to plead not guilty, which means this case will be litigated publicly for months. Are you prepared for extended media attention? I considered the question while reviewing partnership proposals that had arrived since the morning news coverage. Extended media attention would mean continued opportunities to position Evergreen as the ethical alternative to traditional consulting. Firms compromised by criminal activities. David, Marcus chose to commit federal crimes rather than have honest conversations about our future. If he wants to litigate this publicly, he'll simply provide more opportunities for me to demonstrate why ethical business practices create sustainable, competitive advantages. Sarah was fielding phone calls from potential clients who had read the morning news coverage and wanted to discuss consulting services. Elena, we're going to need additional staff immediately. I've received 12 serious inquiries since 9 a.m., including 3 Fortune 500 companies. The consulting revolution the Wall Street Journal had described was happening in real time. Marcus's criminal enterprise had created the perfect market conditions for ethical firms like Evergreen to capture clients who were concerned about trusting traditional partnerships that might be compromised by internal corruption. My personal phone rang, a call from Marcus's mother, Elena Rodriguez Sr., who had raised him to be better than the criminal he'd become. Elena, I saw the news this morning. I don't understand how Marcus became involved in something like this, but I want you to know that his father and I support you completely. The conversation was brief, but emotionally significant. Marcus's own family was choosing to support the wife he'd betrayed rather than defend the criminal he'd become. Mrs. Rodriguez, I appreciate your call more than you know. This situation isn't easy for anyone who cares about Marcus. Elena, my son made his choices, and now he has to face the consequences. But you, You built something honorable while he was destroying everything. That tells me everything I need to know about who deserves support. After hanging up, I felt a profound sense of validation. Marcus's mother understood what he had apparently never grasped, that success built through ethical means was more valuable and sustainable than wealth acquired through criminal activities. The afternoon brought news of Marcus's arraignment, where he had indeed pleaded not guilty and been denied bail due to flight risk concerns. Federal prosecutors had presented evidence of the Cayman Islands escape plan and offshore account access, convincing the judge that Marcus would flee the country if released. "Elena," Sarah said, reviewing the latest media coverage, "the business press is calling this the consulting courage story. They're positioning you as the entrepreneur who turned personal betrayal into professional triumph through strategic thinking and ethical business practices." The narrative was crystallizing exactly as I'd hoped. Instead of being remembered as the victim of criminal fraud, I was being recognized as the strategic leader who had built a successful business while successfully defending against criminal attack. David returned from monitoring Marcus's arraignment with video footage of my husband in federal custody. "Elena, he looked completely broken. The reality of 40-year prison sentences and total asset forfeiture has apparently sunk in." I watched the brief video of Marcus being led away in handcuffs, noting how different he looked from the arrogant attorney who had dismissed my business achievements just a week ago. Prison jumpsuit instead of expensive suits, handcuffs instead of luxury watches, and the hollow expression of someone who finally understood the true cost of his criminal choices. "David, has Marcus made any attempts to contact me?" His attorney requested a meeting through the prosecutor's office, but they were told you're under no obligation to speak with him. The federal victims' rights advocate emphasized that any communication would be voluntary on your part. I considered the request while reviewing congressional testimony preparation materials. Marcus probably wanted to apologize, to explain his actions, or perhaps to beg for some kind of support during his legal proceedings. But I had no interest in providing comfort to someone who had spent months planning to destroy my life while I was building the business success he was now watching from a federal detention cell. "David, please inform the prosecutor that I have no interest in meeting with Marcus. My focus is on helping other victims recover their losses and ensuring justice is served." The rest of the afternoon was spent coordinating with congressional staff about my upcoming testimony, reviewing partnership agreements with Morrison Group's legal team, and responding to client inquiries that continued arriving as news coverage spread. By evening, Evergreen Consulting had transformed from a small business advisory firm into a nationally recognized example of ethical business practices triumphing over criminal corruption. Marcus's money laundering scheme had inadvertently created the perfect market conditions for my company's expansion. As I prepared to leave the office, Sarah handed me a summary of the day's developments: 12 new client inquiries, congressional, testimony scheduled, partnership agreements finalized, and media coverage that positioned Evergreen as a leader in ethical consulting services. "Elena, in one day, Marcus's criminal exposure has accelerated our business growth by at least 2 years. His attempt to destroy you has instead created the foundation for your complete professional triumph." I looked out the window at the city, skyline, thinking about Marcus sitting in a federal detention cell while I was building the consulting empire that would forever eclipse the criminal enterprise he'd constructed. The media storm was just beginning, but its direction was clear. Marcus would be remembered as the criminal attorney who betrayed clients and spouse alike. I would be remembered as the strategic entrepreneur who turned personal betrayal into professional victory through ethical business practices and superior strategic thinking. After all, the best revenge wasn't just ensuring Marcus faced justice for his crimes, it was succeeding so spectacularly that his criminal activities became footnotes to my business success story. The Hart Senate office building was a monument to American legislative power, its marble corridors echoing with the footsteps of senators, staffers, and witnesses who shaped national policy. As I walked toward the Banking Committee hearing room, flanked by David Chen and our newly hired federal relations consultant, I carried testimony that would transform my personal experience with criminal fraud into recommendations for protecting businesses and individuals from similar predatory schemes. "Mrs. Rodriguez," said Patricia Williams, the committee's chief counsel, "your written testimony has already generated significant interest among the senators. They're particularly interested in your recommendations for early detection of professional misconduct and your company's innovative security protocols." The hearing room was packed with journalists, financial industry representatives, and other fraud victims who had been selected to testify about money laundering through professional services. Cameras from C-SPAN, CNN, and the major networks were positioned to capture what the media had already dubbed the most compelling fraud victim testimony in Senate history. Senator Elizabeth Warren, the committee chair, called the hearing to order with the kind of authoritative presence that had made her a national figure in financial regulation. Today, we examine how trusted professionals, attorneys, accountants, and financial advisors exploit their positions to facilitate money laundering and fraud. Our first witness represents both the devastating impact of professional misconduct and the resilience of ethical business practices in overcoming criminal corruption. As I took my seat at the witness table, I could see Marcus's former colleagues from Blackstone and Associates scattered throughout the gallery, their faces reflecting the professional devastation that had consumed their firm since the arrests began. 3 additional partners had been indicted over the weekend as prosecutors traced Marcus's criminal network through the firm's client relationships. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Senator Warren began, "please tell the committee how you discovered that your husband was using his legal practice to facilitate money laundering." For the next 30 minutes, I provided detailed testimony about Marcus's fraudulent house sale, the forged signatures, the emptied bank accounts, and the sophisticated criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of innocent clients. The senators listened with evident attention as I described how traditional oversight mechanisms had failed to detect or prevent Marcus's crimes. "Mrs. Rodriguez," interrupted Senator John Kennedy, "your written testimony mentions that you were simultaneously building a successful consulting business while your husband was committing these crimes. Can you explain how that's relevant to our regulatory discussions?" This was the opening I'd been preparing for, the opportunity to demonstrate how ethical business practices could provide superior security and performance compared to traditional firms compromised by criminal activities. "Senator Kennedy, my experience illustrates why ethical business foundations create sustainable competitive advantages. While my husband was violating client trust and professional standards to generate short-term criminal profits, I was building long-term client relationships based on transparency, security, and measurable results." I clicked to my first presentation slide, showing Evergreen's client retention rates compared to industry averages. Ethical practices aren't just morally superior, they're economically superior. Our clients stay with us because they trust our security protocols and value our commitment to their success rather than our own profits. Senator Warren leaned forward with interest. "Mrs. Rodriguez, your company successfully defended against criminal attacks, while traditional firms like your husband's were facilitating criminal activities. What can Congress learn from your security protocols?" Senator Warren, the key is proactive monitoring rather than reactive oversight. We implemented continuous security auditing, redundant verification systems, and immediate threat response protocols that allowed us to detect and counter criminal activities within hours rather than months. The next slide showed how Marcus's hacking attempts had been traced, blocked, and documented in real time, providing evidence for federal prosecutors while protecting client data. Several senators took notes as I explained how small businesses could implement similar security measures to protect against internal threats. "Mrs. Rodriguez," said Senator Tim Scott, "you've mentioned that your husband's criminal activities inadvertently created business opportunities for your firm. Can you elaborate on that paradox?" I smiled. thinking about the Morrison Group partnership and the 12 new client contracts that had resulted from the scandal publicity. Senator Scott, criminals create market inefficiencies that ethical businesses can exploit. When Blackstone and Associates collapsed due to criminal corruption, their clients needed alternative services. Our demonstrated ability to defend against criminal attack became a competitive advantage that attracted clients who prioritized security and ethics. The hearing continued with questions about regulatory recommendations, early warning systems, and victim protection protocols. Each answer allowed me to demonstrate how strategic thinking and ethical practices had not only protected me from Marcus's crimes, but had transformed those crimes into the foundation for business expansion. During the lunch break, I was approached by representatives from 3 Fortune 500 companies who had watched the testimony on C-SPAN and wanted to discuss consulting services. The national exposure was generating the kind of high-level business opportunities that typically took years to develop. "Mrs. Rodriguez," said Dr. James Harrison from Meridian Pharmaceuticals, "your testimony demonstrates exactly the kind of risk management thinking our board wants to implement. We've had concerns about internal threats, and your security protocols seem perfectly suited to our needs." Sarah, who had been monitoring media coverage from Evergreen's temporary Washington office, sent updates throughout the day. CNN calling you the entrepreneur who turned betrayal into triumph. Bloomberg requesting exclusive about your expansion. Plans. Harvard Business School wants you for their executive leadership program. The afternoon session focused on regulatory recommendations, allowing me to present specific proposals for enhancing oversight of professional services while protecting legitimate business operations. My suggestions for mandatory security training, continuous monitoring systems, and rapid response protocols were being recorded for inclusion in potential legislation. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Senator Warren said as the hearing approached its conclusion, "your case represents both the worst and best of American business. Criminal corruption defeated by ethical innovation. What message do you want other entrepreneurs to take from your experience?" I paused, thinking about Marcus sitting in federal detention while I testified before the United States Senate about transforming his criminal betrayal into business success. "Senator Warren, my message is that ethical business practices aren't just about moral values. They're about strategic advantages. Criminals like my husband create short-term profits through deception and fraud, but ethical entrepreneurs create sustainable success through transparency and excellence. When those approaches compete, ethics wins every time." The hearing concluded with unanimous committee approval for my regulatory recommendations and invitations to consult on implementing the proposed oversight reforms. As I gathered my materials, I received a text from David Chen. "Marcus attempted suicide in federal detention last night. Unsuccessful. Now on psychiatric hold." The news hit me with unexpected complexity. Part of me felt sympathy for the man I'd once loved, now broken by the consequences of his own criminal choices. But a larger part recognized that Marcus's breakdown was simply the final evidence of the fundamental weakness that had led him to choose criminal shortcuts instead of building sustainable success. Outside the Hart Building, I gave brief interviews to reporters who had covered the hearing. The questions focused on my plans for Evergreen's expansion, my role in developing new business security standards, and my perspective on transforming personal adversity into professional opportunity. "Mrs. Rodriguez," asked the CNN correspondent, "when you discovered your husband's crimes, did you ever imagine that situation would lead to testifying before Congress and becoming a national expert on business ethics?" I considered the question while thinking about the journey from discovering the forged house sale documents to standing on the steps of the U.S. Senate as a recognized authority on ethical business practices. Marcus spent 3 years underestimating my capabilities while planning criminal activities that he thought would destroy my future. He never imagined that his crimes would instead create the platform for my greatest professional achievements. Sometimes the best response to betrayal is succeeding so completely that the betrayer becomes irrelevant to your story. The flight back to our city provided time to review the day's developments and plan for the dramatic business expansion that congressional testimony had accelerated. Sarah had received 43 serious client inquiries during the hearing, including requests from government agencies, Fortune 500 corporations, and international businesses that wanted to implement Evergreen security protocols. Elena, Sarah, said, reviewing her notes as our plane descended, "We need to discuss scaling challenges. The demand for our services now exceeds our current capacity by approximately 1,000%. We need to decide whether to expand organically or consider acquisition opportunities." I thought about the possibilities while watching the city lights below. Marcus had tried to steal our house to fund his escape to the Cayman Islands. Instead, his criminal exposure had created business opportunities that would require multiple office locations and hundreds of employees to service properly. Sarah, let's explore acquisition opportunities. I want to know which consulting firms are struggling financially and might benefit from merger discussions, particularly firms that lost clients due to ethical concerns. The irony would be perfect, using the business success generated by Marcus's criminal exposure to acquire struggling firms that had been damaged by their own ethical failures or market disruption caused by scandals like the Blackstone collapse. Landing at our home airport, I was greeted by additional media requests and a message from the federal prosecutor handling Marcus's case. The suicide attempt had occurred after Marcus watched my congressional testimony on the detention center's television system. According to the prosecutor, Marcus had become increasingly agitated as he realized that his criminal activities had transformed me into a nationally recognized business leader. "Mrs. Rodriguez," the prosecutor's message read, "the defendant is requesting another meeting opportunity. His attorney claims he wants to provide additional cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing. However, you should know that Mr. Rodriguez's primary motivation appears to be obtaining your forgiveness rather than providing useful information." I deleted the message without responding. Marcus's desire for forgiveness was irrelevant to my priorities of helping other victims recover their losses and building Evergreen into the premier consulting firm for ethical business transformation. The drive home, to the luxury downtown apartment I'd leased with proceeds from federal compensation for the seized house, provided time to process the day's significance. In 6 hours of congressional testimony, I had transformed from a fraud victim into a national expert whose recommendations would influence federal regulation of professional services. Marcus had spent months planning criminal activities that he thought would fund his escape from our marriage and his professional responsibilities. Instead, his crimes had created the foundation for my emergence as a leader in ethical business practices, with a platform that reached the highest levels of American government. The evening news coverage confirmed the day's impact. Every major network featured segments about the congressional hearing, with particular focus on my recommendations for protecting businesses and individuals from professional misconduct. The coverage positioned Evergreen Consulting as the example of how ethical practices could triumph over criminal corruption through strategic thinking and superior business methods. As I reviewed partnership proposals that had arrived during my testimony, I calculated the transformation that Marcus's criminal exposure had accelerated. In 2 weeks, I had gone from running a small consulting firm to testifying before Congress and fielding acquisition offers from major corporations. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the business success or national recognition. The real satisfaction was in knowing that Marcus now understood, from his federal detention cell, that his biggest mistake hadn't been committing crimes. It had been underestimating the woman whose success would forever eclipse his criminal failure. After all, the best revenge wasn't just achieving success despite his betrayal. It was succeeding so completely that his crimes became the foundation for achievements he could never have imagined. 6 months later, I stood in the corner office of Evergreen, Consulting's new headquarters, a gleaming 40-story tower in the financial district that housed our staff of 200 consultants and served clients across 3 continents. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the courthouse where Marcus's trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier with guilty verdicts on all federal charges and a sentence of 45 years in prison without possibility of parole. The transformation had been so complete it sometimes felt surreal. The woman who had discovered her husband's fraud while working from a spare bedroom now ran a consulting empire that had acquired 2 former competitors and was negotiating partnerships with governments in 4 countries. Marcus's criminal activities had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for building the ethical business dynasty he'd tried to destroy. Elena, the victim restitution ceremony is in 30 minutes, Sarah announced, entering my office with the final documentation from federal asset recovery efforts. Every fraud victim will receive full compensation plus interest from the criminal asset sales. I reviewed the restitution summary while considering the poetic justice of the outcome. Marcus's luxury purchases, offshore accounts, and even his law firm ownership interest had been liquidated to compensate the people he'd victimized. His attempt to steal from innocent clients had resulted in them receiving more money than they'd originally lost. Sarah, what's the final count on new business generated by the congressional testimony? 87 new clients, including 12 Fortune 500 companies and 3 federal agencies. The Harvard Business School case study about our expansion has generated additional inquiries from international corporations. Marcus's criminal exposure is now taught as an example of how ethical businesses can capitalize on market disruptions caused by competitor corruption. The Harvard case study had been particularly satisfying. Business schools across the country were using Evergreen's growth as a teaching tool for strategic thinking, ethical business practices, and competitive advantage through superior security protocols. Marcus's crimes had become educational content that would influence future business leaders for decades. My secure phone buzzed with a message from David Chen. Final surveillance report completed. Marcus's criminal network resulted in 23 total convictions, $47 million in recovered assets, and complete dismantling of 3 money laundering operations. Victoria Sterling received 35 years. Case officially closed. 23 convictions. Marcus hadn't just destroyed his own life. His criminal activities had exposed an entire network of corrupt professionals who were now serving lengthy federal sentences. The investigation that began with his fraudulent house sale had become one of the largest financial crime prosecutions in federal history. The intercom chimed with my assistant's voice. "Mrs. Rodriguez, there's a call from the Department of Justice. They want to discuss your nomination for the Financial Crimes Advisory Board." I smiled, remembering Marcus's dismissive comments about my little consulting business while he was secretly planning federal crimes. The advisory board position would give me input on national policy for combating professional misconduct and money laundering schemes. Tell them I'll return the call after the restitution ceremony, and please confirm my appearance at tomorrow's Economic Summit, the panel on ethical business leadership. The victim restitution ceremony was held at the federal courthouse, in the same building where Marcus had been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. 37 victims gathered to receive compensation checks that would restore their financial security while marking the conclusion of their nightmare with Marcus's criminal enterprise. Margaret Chen from Morrison Group attended as a witness to the ceremony and a supporter of the victims' recovery. Our partnership had expanded beyond consulting services to include a joint venture developing ethical business practices training for corporations worldwide. "Elena," Margaret said, as we watched victims receive their compensation. "When we first met, I thought we were hiring a consulting firm. Instead, we discovered a business philosophy that's transformed our entire corporate culture." The Morrison partnership had indeed exceeded all expectations. Their implementation of Evergreen's ethical business protocols had increased employee satisfaction by 60%, reduced operational costs by 30%, and generated positive media coverage that had attracted both customers and top-tier talent. Federal prosecutor Janet Morrison addressed the gathering with remarks about justice, accountability, and the importance of victims finding closure through both financial compensation and criminal prosecution. This case demonstrates that no matter how sophisticated the criminal scheme, law enforcement and ethical business practices working together can ensure justice prevails. As victims shared their stories of financial recovery and restored security, I reflected on the journey from discovering forged documents to standing in a federal courthouse surrounded by people whose lives had been restored through the investigation. Marcus's crimes had triggered. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. James Harrison at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Elena, Board approved your proposal for establishing the Evergreen Institute for Business Ethics. Full funding secured for 5-year program, this will be a game changer for corporate America. The Evergreen Institute represented the culmination of my strategic vision, a research and training organization that would establish ethical business practices as competitive advantages rather than mere compliance requirements. The institute would be funded by corporations that had learned, often through painful experience, that ethical foundations created sustainable success. After the ceremony, I returned to Evergreen's headquarters for a meeting with our international expansion team. The London office was opening next month, followed by Hong Kong and São Paulo locations that would serve clients seeking alternatives to traditional consulting firms compromised by ethical failures. Elena, said Jennifer Walsh, our new director of international operations, the same real estate agent who had discovered Marcus's forged documents and had since joined Evergreen after Pemberton Real Estate's reputation was destroyed by their involvement in the fraud scheme. The European Union wants to discuss implementing our security protocols as mandatory standards for financial services firms. The EU discussion represented validation of Evergreen's methodologies on a global scale. What had begun as my response to Marcus's criminal activities was becoming international policy for protecting businesses and consumers from professional misconduct. David Chen arrived for our monthly security briefing. Though these meetings had evolved from crisis management to strategic planning as Evergreen's growth required increasingly sophisticated protection protocols. Elena, final update on Marcus's situation. He's been transferred to a maximum security federal facility in Colorado. According to prison records, he spends most of his time in the library, reading business publications that cover Evergreen's expansion and your professional achievements. The image of Marcus reading about my success from a prison cell provided a kind of closure that no amount of financial compensation could match. His attempt to destroy my future had instead created the foundation for achievements that exceeded anything he could have imagined during his criminal career. David, any security concerns about the new international offices? None related to Marcus or his former associates. They're all serving lengthy sentences. Our current security protocols are actually being studied by federal agencies as best practices for protecting sensitive corporate information. The afternoon brought meetings with acquisition targets, partnership discussions with technology companies, and planning sessions for the Evergreen Institute's curriculum development. Each conversation reinforced how completely Marcus's criminal exposure had transformed the business landscape in our favor. Sarah entered my office at 5 p.m. with the day's final update. Elena, Harvard wants you for their commencement address next spring. The theme is Transforming Adversity into Achievement. They specifically mentioned how your response to criminal betrayal exemplifies strategic thinking and ethical leadership. A Harvard commencement address would provide a platform to inspire future business leaders while cementing Evergreen's reputation as the premier example of ethical business triumph. The invitation was validation that my response to Marcus's crimes had created educational value extending far beyond commercial success. As the workday concluded, I walked through Evergreen's offices, observing the 200 employees whose careers had been built on the foundation of ethical business practices that Marcus had tried to destroy. Their success represented the positive transformation that could emerge from responding strategically to criminal betrayal. The drive home to my penthouse apartment, purchased with proceeds from Evergreen's success rather than criminal asset, seizure, provided time to reflect on the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred since discovering Marcus's fraudulent house sale. 6 months ago, I had been the unemployed wife whose husband was secretly planning to steal our home and flee the country with criminal proceeds. Tonight, I was the CEO of an international consulting empire whose ethical business practices were being studied by governments and universities worldwide. My phone rang one final time, a call from my attorney with news about Marcus's latest legal development. Elena, Marcus's attorney, filed an appeal, but it was rejected. His sentence is final, 45 years in federal prison. However, they also submitted a letter that Marcus wanted you to receive. I'm not interested in reading Marcus's letters. Elena, you should know that according to his attorney, Marcus spends his days reading business publications and watching news coverage about Evergreen's success. He apparently understands now that his criminal activities created the exact opposite outcome from what he intended. I ended the call without requesting the letter. Marcus's belated understanding of his failures was irrelevant to my priorities of building sustainable business success and helping other entrepreneurs learn from my experience. That evening, as I reviewed proposals for Evergreen's expansion into Asia-Pacific markets, I received a notification that the final episode of a documentary series about white-collar crime had aired. The episode focused on Marcus's case and featured extensive interviews about how his criminal activities had inadvertently accelerated my business success. The documentary's conclusion perfectly captured the irony. Marcus Rodriguez's attempt to destroy his wife's future through criminal fraud instead created the foundation for her emergence as one of America's most successful entrepreneurs. His 45-year prison sentence ensures he will spend the rest of his life watching Elena Rodriguez build the ethical business empire that his crimes made possible. Standing on my apartment balcony, overlooking the city where Marcus and I had once shared what I thought was a future together, I considered the complete transformation that had occurred through strategic thinking and ethical business practices. Marcus had chosen criminal shortcuts because he believed success required deception and exploitation. His punishment wasn't just the prison sentence. It was watching from his cell as ethical business practices created achievements that far exceeded anything his criminal enterprise could have generated. The best revenge hadn't been destroying Marcus's future, though his 45-year sentence certainly accomplished that. The best revenge had been building something so successful that his criminal activities became footnotes to my business triumph. Tomorrow would bring new clients, expansion opportunities, and strategic challenges that would further establish Evergreen as the premier example of how ethical practices create sustainable competitive advantages. The Evergreen Institute would begin training the next generation of business leaders to choose ethical foundations over criminal shortcuts. And somewhere in a Colorado federal prison, Marcus would continue reading about achievements that demonstrated exactly how much he had underestimated the woman whose success would forever eclipse his criminal failure. After all, the ultimate revenge wasn't just succeeding despite his betrayal, it was succeeding so completely that his biggest regret would be underestimating me in the first place. The story was complete, but the success would continue for decades. Marcus had tried to steal my future, but instead had provided the foundation for building something greater than either of us had ever imagined possible. And that, perhaps, was the most perfect revenge of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.